Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the fourth Keele Debate of the year. My name's Kevin Shakesheff. I'm the Vice-Chancellor at Keele University, and my first duty is to welcome my co-chair, Zoe Garnett, who's our Students' Union Wellbeing Officer, and Zoe's going to chair with me today. So thanks for doing that, Zoe.
Hello, everyone.
Just to say a little bit about the format, it's our fourth debate, as I say, and we're into a format where we've asked our panel each to present for about 7 to 8 minutes on the subject of the debate. Whilst people are speaking, you can ask questions, which we'll pose in the second part of the evening. And if you go to the top of the screen, there's a Q&A tab. So click on there, add your question. You also have an exciting voting mechanism where you can vote on questions that you really like. I just stress this is not a democracy, so we will be able to ignore the votes, but we will be influenced by them, won't we, Zoe? Yeah. And just to say a little bit about what we want to do with the debates. So as I came in as new Vice-Chancellor to Keele, we're setting up our new strategy. And I was particularly keen to get some disagreement going. And I think universities, as we know, fantastic organisations do great stuff, but we've also got a lot of challenges. And I think our best way collectively through that challenge is to disagree openly and to find solutions based on people working together where maybe they don't have the same views of how universities should be. So we've so far explored the future for international students. We've looked at AI and what it means for our students when they graduate. We've looked into the balance between being a good civic partner and being a good international university. Tonight's debate is one that I was really keen to have and to co-chair with our Students' Union. And I guess it's about student experience. And deliberately, it's asking ourselves the question, is our current approach helping or hindering students? I'm going to give a very quick personal example. And this is from my own experience, going back to the late 80s. And I should say, I know it's possible to speak with rose-tinted glasses and think everything was better, and I absolutely don't think that. I think universities are much better today than they were 35 years ago. But I do just reflect on a learning experience that I had. We didn't have the National Student Survey, and just at the time when I would have been voted on it if I'd been 20 years younger, we had a final year project working with a professor on a research project, and I think the professor was really clear that he found the whole concept of students irritating. If you managed to pin him down and get any advice from him, it was largely useless. And the whole of the learning experience, it was unclear what a good outcome should be and what I should be doing. And I reflect on that and think it was probably the most valuable learning experience I had at university, because when I went out into the world of work, I irritated lots of people, lots of advice was useless, and it was often unclear what to do. And I'm sort of grateful for the fact that some of the experiences at university were confusing, and finding my own way through them was useful. So I just wanted to pose that, at the start and just ask ourselves, are we turning universities into too comfortable an experience for students? And so on that note, I'm going to hand over to Zoe, and she's going to tell us about the panel. And I noticed Jim's here as well, Zoe.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, so we've got an amazing number of panelists here today. I'm going to start off really strong with Sir Michael Barber. So Sir Michael Barber is one of the leading education and government experts of the last 20 years. He was once described by Time magazine as the single most influential educator on the face of the earth. So very big compliment there. He served as the chief advisor to the Secretary of State for Education on schools standards from 1997 to 2001, during which time school performance in England improved significantly. In 2001, he set up the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit in 10 Downing Street to ensure the successful implementation of the Prime Minister's priorities in domestic policy, including education and health. Having worked as head of McKinsey's global education practice and as Pearson's chief education advisor, Michael set up with others his own company, Delivery Associates, which helps governments deliver results citizens care about. From 2017 to 2021, he was chair of the Office for Students, which regulates the higher education system in England. In 2023, he advised the Chancellor of the Eshka on the skills agenda. He is currently the UK Prime Minister's advisor on the effective delivery and FCDO envoy on governance in the Palestinian Authority. He is an honorary fellow of Queen's College, Oxford, and Chancellor of the University of Exeter. And he is also chair of Somerset County Cricket Club. So a lot of achievements there throughout his life. Gosh, way to start off strong. On to the next person, Jenny Shaw. Jenny is widely recognised as a values-led leader in higher education and purpose-built student accommodation with over a decade of senior experience in each sector. She is also a seasoned consultant with a strong track record of delivering strategic insight and practical solutions for organisations across the UK, spanning HE, FE, the private sector and the third sector. Jenny previously held senior leadership roles at Unite Students, which include Student Experience Director and Higher Education External Engagement Director, and over the last 30 years has developed a reputation for innovation, analytical rigour, thoughtful challenge and evidence-based problem solving across student accommodation, student wellbeing and mental health, widening access and equity, diversity and inclusion. So definitely deserves a space on this panel as well. Dr. Paul Greatrix. So Dr. Paul Greatrix brings over 35 years of experience in higher education sector, including 18 years as registrar at the University of Nottingham, a former executive member of Association of Heads of University Administration and president of UMaine. Paul is a respected leader in university management and governance. As Director of Higher Education Consultancy at Shakespeare Martineau, Paul supports institutions in strategic planning, governance, and responding to sector challenges in the UK and internationally. He also recognised. He is also a recognised author and podcaster in the HE space, continuing to shape sector thought leadership. Very good stuff there as well. Sophie, don't even really need to read this off, to be honest, because I've worked with her the last 2 years, but she's been excellent. She's been the elected Development Democracy Officer at Keele Students' Union, originally from Solihull near Birmingham. She came to Keele University in 2020 to study forensic science and psychology before moving into a master's in forensics and analytical sciences after discovering her passion for forensics. Sophie first got involved with the Students' Union through craft and rock appreciation societies and American football during her second year at Keele. She's been through so many, that's like probably like 20 clubs and societies in total, and has built a strong connection with the student life across campus, very well known at Keele. And as part of Sophie's role, she supports students with issues around campus, campaign networks, SU and university suggestions, democracy and elections, and sustainability as well. And finally, to introduce Jim Dickinson, who is the Associate Editor for SUs at Wonkhe, and takes a particular interest in student experience, university governance and regulation, and leads our work with student unions, including our study tours to Europe. His career background is in support of student leadership. He's held senior roles at the National Union of Students, where he led on SU development, campaigns and political strategy, and was the CEO at the SU at UEA, providing strategic management for the union's charitable and commercial vehicles, as well as policy support for elected student officers. Jim has served as a governor and trustee in both further and higher education and the voluntary sector, and is a regular speaker at sector events and conferences. He is an obsessive fan of the Eurovision Song Contest and dreams of visiting Moldova. So there we go. That's our panelists for today.
Great job, Zoe. Thank you very much for that. So we're going to invite each person to give their 7 to 8 minutes, and we're going to start with Sir Michael.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Zoe, for that kind of introduction. It just shows you don't need to believe everything you read in Time magazine. I just want to add a couple of things to my CV. One is, given where we are, that I was a professor at Keele from 1993 to 1995 and ran the School of Education for those 2 years. And I love my time there, and it's a beautiful campus, and it was a beautiful university to spend time at. So I'm grateful for that. And then we can talk later, but as an undergraduate, I felt a bit like Sophie in the sense that I loved my studies, but I spent an awful lot of time on other things as well, including running the student union in the college as an elected chair of that, or president of that. Anyway, all of that, I'm going to talk about teaching and learning, which I think the risk with the student experience debate is debate everything except the actual core content of teaching and learning, which is at the heart of what should be the student experience. And I'm going to make 4 or 5 observations about that, and then I look forward to the challenge and the debate from other panelists and from anybody in the audience. You feel free to ask anything you like. I like that. The first point, I'm literally going to make 6 points, but the first one is about fun and joy. I quite often hear people say education should be fun, and I'm not objecting to education being fun. I think it's nice when it's fun, but it's not enough. And joy, so the distinction I'm making is when you learn something really difficult, while you're learning it, it isn't necessarily fun. I can remember being asked to read and then reading a book called The Theory of Possessive Individualism by C.A.B. Macpherson when I was undergraduate. It was really difficult. I read it again and again, and I finally got my head around it. And when I understood what he was on about, I felt a sense of joy. I realized that it had been worth the effort, but I wouldn't say it was a fun experience while I was doing it. And I think it's very important that that teaching and learning in university takes people through difficult things and they get that amazing feeling of joy. I don't mind so much whether it's fun on the way. Of course, some of it will be, some of it might not be. But when things are really difficult, they're not fun on the way often. And that's not the point. So fun and joy, that's my first point. Second point, Kevin mentioned this in his introduction, disagreement and disagreeing productively and openly is a really important part of the student experience in class, in learning situations, and more generally. I do think that's very, very important. My own recollection of that as an undergraduate was intervening in a lecture by a guy called R.M. Hartwell. It was a lecture about the standard of living in the early 19th century. And he was very good historian, but very much an advocate of the free market, and I wasn't. And I intervened partway through his lecture and interrupted him. And I'd taken in a pile of books and we began a debate. And then he said to myself and my friend who'd interrupted him, look, there are 100 people in the room. They want to hear my lecture. That's what they came for. But you're raising a really important debate. So you can come back to my room and anybody else can come if you want, and we'll set a session in my office to follow up on the debate. And we went round, we prepared really well. We had a vigorous debate. We tried to persuade him that he was wrong, but obviously he knew the stuff much better than we did. And at one point I offered him a book and said, but you should read this. And he looked at the cover and the back of it, and then he gave it back to me. He said, Michael, I've worked out that I'm going to be able to read 1,000 more books in my life, and I'm not reading any crap. So that was fun, but it was genuinely good, and I remember the content of that debate better than quite a lot of else that I did at university 50 years ago. Third thing I want to say is about tailored commentary on work handed in, whether it's essays or assignments or whatever you want to call them. I'm currently a student. Actually, I'm a fully fee-paying part-time master's student studying medieval history at Exeter University, and my tutor, I think that's what he calls himself, is a brilliant guy called James Clark, who's written lots of fantastic stuff about medieval history. And when I send some written work to him, I get the most remarkable commentary on what I've written. He's not hesitant about being critical. He mentions sources I should have looked at but haven't. He recommends, it's just absolutely brilliant. By the way, it's not always fun. You think, wow, I really didn't get, but you go away and you do it again and it's better. So I think that the feedback you get on assignments, and I'd call it tailored commentary, I do think is really important. Fourth point, when there are lectures in universities, I think it's really important that they're well planned, they have a narrative or at least a structure, and that if it's a series of lectures, that they scaffold so that one builds on the other, and there's a proper narrative arc, you might call it in modern language, but there's a proper building of what that, and so the planning and structure of lectures is important. And it's important that those, because it's easy to do now, those lectures are made available online and you can go back and check them if you're a student. The best place I've seen that is in the National University in Singapore, but lots of people do it. You may well do it at Keele, but I do think that's important. And it's relatively straightforward to do. And it's the job of a lecturer to do a lecture that has the characteristics I've just described, I think. Fifth point, you can do now, if you're running a course in a university, you can do excellent online materials. My favourite example is King's College London, which has a fantastic course on it's called New Labour in Power, 1997 to 2010. I teach on it for obvious reasons. But when you start on that course, they give you an iPad, and on there you get all the lectures they've had from visiting lecturers, which include Tony Blair, Charles Clarke, Gordon Brown, Ed Balls, Nick Macpherson, who used to run the Treasury, myself, and so on. Tessa Zhao, when she was still, well, so lots and lots of people have taught on it, and you get, this is very tailored content because it's those people speaking to King's College students on a previous occasion. And in the current classes, in addition to that, you get the last time that class finished, because they've now moved it into the coalition years, the last lesson was taught by David Cameron. So tailored content and really good online materials are things that are within the grasp of universities. And the final thing I'll say is I think the TEF, while not perfect, has been a force for good in raising the standards of teaching and learning. Before the Office for Students was set up and I became chair, I was on the council at Exeter University and I worked with the relevant exec team to do the first TEF, and we worked actively with brilliant students from the union in Exeter called the Student Guild. They were fantastic and they were a crucial part of TEF Gold at Exeter on each of the occasions it's run. But I do think that has got people to focus on teaching and learning in a way that they didn't do before. So that's my few minutes. Hopefully I haven't overrun, and I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much for a stimulating start to the evening. So just a reminder to people, keep your questions coming in on that Q&A tab, and we'll pass over to Jenny for the next speech.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just jump straight into the question: are universities supporting students enough or too much? And my starting point for this is education, higher education particularly, must include some challenge. Challenge is a part of the learning process. Frustration is necessary for growth, and even overwhelm can drive new perspectives, new innovations. But I would also add that despair, burnout, alienation, fear, these things don't lead anywhere good. They don't lead to, well, they could eventually be learning from them, but I would suggest that these things are not really compatible with the goals of higher education. So what I'm saying is that appropriate support is not about removing challenge, but it is about creating an appropriate level of safety and comfort so that students can persist in their learning, they can take intellectual risks, they're empowered to learn. And I also think that students should be active in their support, but again, it is about creating the conditions for all students to be able to engage with that support. And there is a context here. Among higher education applicants today, over a third have missed school due to their mental health over the last 2 years. Most, not all, but most of today's students have had significant disruption to their secondary schooling due to the pandemic. Students have growing concerns about world events and challenges, and especially about the graduate labour market. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Of course, as well, increasing financial challenge for students and for their universities. So there's a lot going on. And I think also it does tend to limit a little bit our ability to be able to sort of look to the past. I mean, the past teaches us, but things are quite different now. So what I'm going to do is to propose some non-negotiables in terms of student support in higher education for today, and then reflect on the question a little bit more. And the first of my non-negotiables is good communication. It's a really basic thing, but it's not always done well, particularly inevitably in very large, complex organisation. So communication that is clear, that is jargon-free, because not every student knows the terminology. Communication that is coherent and coordinated, so that messages don't contradict themselves. Communication that is well-timed. And for messages that could be challenging, including information about support that is available when the message is received, and portraying that as okay, it's okay to ask for support if you need it. It could be effective for you. And you definitely do that without alarming students or infantilizing them. I've seen it done really well. My second one is inclusivity. Learning, teaching, assessment, professional services, campus services. They should all be accessible and relevant for all students. And it's easy to assume that is already the case. So 5 years ago, when we did the Living Black at University research, there was a default assumption across the sector that student accommodation was, pretty much okay for everyone. It was really not true. It turned out not to be true at all. And it's really important to challenge assumptions in any service, any process in higher education, as anywhere else. A lot of these were developed by groups of people who were not as diverse as the student body, and they miss things. So a few years ago, I was still seeing processes that assume all students have parents or guardians. These days, I still see services that assume, for example, Western secular approaches to mental health work for all students, which is not the case. And I'm sure you'll be able to think of many other examples. Always challenge assumptions. The third one is staff that can respond appropriately to student distress. Mainly, this is about being a good human, but with boundaries, knowing when it's appropriate to refer or escalate, understanding safeguarding, knowing when to ask questions, knowing when to suggest things. And going back to inclusivity, also having a good understanding for the context for different groups of students, because different students need different things. Also, proper staff well-being and support is essential, which is quite a tall order at the moment, I think. The final of my non-negotiables, reporting processes that are actually accessible. So it means students completely understand the process, they feel able to use the process, they feel safe, they think it's effective, they feel confident in the staff who are involved, which can be quite difficult to achieve for students with a history of experiencing harassment, whether that's sexual or racial or religious. If they have had poor experiences in the past, they might not trust the process. And of course, this is regulated by OFS through the E6 conditions, so it's one of their non-negotiables as well. So going back to the question, universities offer a lot of support at the moment. Is it too much? I have seen examples where not enough support caused harm to students, but could too much support also be causing harm? It's possible. If it creates a dependence, if it causes a student to be weaker than before, and if the support itself is traumatizing, that could cause harm. But actually, what I'm describing here is quite bad support. So partly it's about the quality of that support. But if I think back over the last 30 years, I have seen vast landscapes of harm from lack of support. And the ongoing need for fair access and participation is in many ways, I think, a story of past failures. We see that in awarding gaps, we see that in continuation gaps and other inequalities. It is very hard to get a perfect balance of support because different students need different things. But I would suggest that too much support is the lesser of two evils. And very final thought, looking to the future, AI, I'm just going to go there. It will significantly change learning, teaching and assessment over the coming years. What becomes more important in the labour market in an AI world is what students are asking at the moment. And the optimist in me wants to say human skills such as ethics, collaboration, resilience, judgment, well-being, inclusivity, compassion. These are the things that we need if we're going to have a world that is worth living in. And I see these skills embedded already in the best of student support. Thank you.
Jenny, thank you very much for that. We're going to move on next to Paul.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to start with setting aside my personal experience as a student. I've been a student at 3 institutions, all very different, but also in circumstances which were very, very different from where today's students are. And I think that it's really important that personal experience doesn't become the principal basis for policy making, because it's probably the least reliable. And it is a long way from the classroom or the residence hall to the Vice-Chancellor's office, or indeed the ministerial suite. So it's important to bear that in mind. And to reframe the question slightly, I think, is it actually possible to support students too much? And is there a risk that if we provide so much support, they become utterly dependent on a range of services and offers and unable to fend for themselves and graduate completely unprepared for life in the real world? I have to say, I don't think so. But that narrative of over supporting students, if you like, has been actually quite common in the United States higher education in recent years. And there was a book published about a decade ago called The Coddling of the American Mind, and it was focused on the ways in which students in higher education were protected from intellectual and emotional harm within universities. So all the mindfulness and mental well-being, etc., was seen as a real problem. It was described by the authors of the book as safetyism, and it interfered with young people's social, emotional, intellectual development, and made it harder for them to become autonomous adults who were able to navigate the bumpy road of life. And the solution to this particular problem essentially included more free speech and less safety. And I think we see the backwash of that in UK higher education, with the emphasis on free speech and challenging students, and emphasis about making things perhaps less safe for them as well. But it goes beyond the classroom and debate and argument into other parts of student life as well. And there is part of this narrative which says that students are living a life of luxury, they're pampered, they're spending all their leisure time on inflatables in lazy rivers and such like, and it's all coddling, right? But even if you can make a case for this being all too much in the way of support, I think it is actually a little bit different in the UK. But there is a wide range of support on offer to students. And I think it's important just to reflect all that. So there's a range of academic support, which has been touched on already, from teaching to personal tutoring, libraries, learning resources, study skills, lots of health and well-being, mental health support, counselling, health centres, disability support, multi-faith chaplaincies, lots in the way of financial advice and hardship support and accommodation, residential, immigration advice too. Careers and employability support has grown and grown over the years. And also the Students' Union plays a key part in student life, academic representation advice, student advocacy clubs and societies and so forth. And there is a very big sporting and active wellbeing agenda as well. Lots more beside, but a huge range of student support mechanisms and processes. And this has grown over the years. It's grown as student populations have grown, but also it's grown in response to demand and expectations from students, and a desire on the part of institutions, I think, to see the provision of such services as an aid to recruitment, a differentiator, or at least meeting the minimum expectations of applicants. Is it all too much? I have to say, I don't think so still. I think it's about enabling. I think it's about enabling students to make the most of the opportunities of being at university and to take all those study opportunities that were mentioned earlier, and to help them focus on their learning rather than just surviving. In the olden days, when I was a student, other members of the panel were students, it was a smaller number of students who on the whole were generally better prepared for life as a student and knew what they were expecting. But now we've got a much larger, more diverse student body, as Jenny mentioned, and a wider range of experiences and disadvantages. So what these support mechanisms actually do, I think, is level the playing field. At the same time, there are those who decry this kind of provision and long for some kind of golden age of the personal tutor, a bit like Kevin's original description of his supervisor. But that depended on everyone, every academic doing the right thing. And of course, when they didn't, it was then up to the student, as in Kevin's case, to find their own way. I'm not certain that is actually such a good solution. A recent HEPI report looked at 20 years of the student experience and suggested that students today were working harder but skipping classes. But more crucially, there was a quote in there about students having a positive sense of well-being are all significantly more likely to say their course provision was good or very good value for money. So that positive sense of well-being is an important part of what all these support services enable. So there is a powerful argument, I think, for more, not less student support. And going back to this argument of the kind of cultural argument, the view that students are mollycoddled, I mean, it is just the case every generation thinks that this generation of students has it easier than the previous generation. But I have to say, I think, as I think Jenny mentioned, this latest group, the students over the past 6 years have had it harder, I think, than any previous generations. The financial pressures, COVID, the pressure to achieve societal changes, social media, all the rest of it, I think, has been more and more challenging for this particular set of students than ever before. So it does seem rather cruel to contemplate reducing support at a time when students most need it. And universities are facing incredible challenges at the moment. It's a difficult financial environment. There's much less money to spend. The value of teaching funding per student's gone down by a quarter over the past 10 or so years. And therefore, in response to these services, actually in the past the solution was simply to grow in response to increasing demand. That's no longer possible. And whilst the answer can't be just about resources, actually, there must be something to be said for more efficiencies, although I'm dubious that AI does have a role to play there. So one way or another, universities have to provide the right level of support. So in conclusion, I don't think there's too much to support for students. Given the shrinkage, universities are going to have to find different ways to provide better support. There will probably be a narrowing of the offer. It therefore means it has to be targeted those who need it most. And really, it's about giving every student the best opportunity to make the most of their higher education potential. So we're supporting them enough, but certainly not too much. And there aren't any lazy rivers in the UK, although Exeter, of course, does have an outdoor pool. And I think it's hard, therefore, to make this case that students are indeed over-supported.
Great, thank you very much, Paul, for stimulating ideas. Let's hear from Sophie next. Over to you, Sophie.
Hi, everyone. It's been really great hearing from everyone else. And, I don't have 35 years experience of anything, actually. I should hopefully be able to give the perspective of students kind of on the ground today. So from my perspective, when we discuss student support, we need to be careful about the assumptions built into the conversation itself. Too often, support is framed as though it's the opposite of independence, as though students are asking to avoid challenge, and as though support somehow weakens resilience. But that fundamentally misunderstands what support actually is. Support is not about removing challenge, support is about removing unnecessary barriers. And that distinction matters enormously, because universities have never been places where students succeed entirely alone. Academic support has always existed: feedback, supervisors, study groups, career services, peer mentoring. Nobody looks at a lecturer giving feedback and says students are becoming dependent, or at career mentoring and says students are being over-supported. Support has always been a part of education because education itself is a developmental process. The real question is not whether support should exist. The real question is whether all students can access support necessary to succeed equally. And nowhere is that clearer than in the way we think about disability and reasonable adjustments. Reasonable adjustments exist under the Equality Act because institutions recognise something fundamental: systems are not naturally accessible to everybody. The very existence of them acknowledges that without intervention, some students are structurally disadvantaged. And disadvantage doesn't come from the student's impairment, but from the environments that were not designed to be inclusive from the outset. Adjustments are then often tacked on afterwards to compensate. So the issue is not that adjustments exist, the issue is that accessibility is still treated as an exception rather than something embedded into design from the beginning. Because being disabled shouldn't simply mean things have to be harder. And Keele's Access and Participation Plan reflects this reality. The university recognises unequal barriers in attainment, continuation, progression, mental health and financial hardship for certain student groups. And Keele's data shows that some students are consistently less likely to attain high degree outcomes, continue their studies, or progress into positive graduate outcomes. And that's not evidence that hardship builds character, that's evidence of structural inequality. And that's not unique to universities. Modern workplaces operate the same way. Employers are legally required to make reasonable adjustments because equality doesn't mean treating everyone identically, regardless of circumstance. So when universities provide flexibility, disability support, or accommodations, they're not shielding students from the real world. They're preparing students for the reality of modern professional environments. And that brings us to the argument about preparation for the real world, because I agree that university should prepare students for life beyond education, but the real world isn't built around abandoning people without support. Successful workplaces provide line managers, mentoring, occupational health, training programs, wellbeing services, reasonable adjustments, professional development, and HR support structures. In many professional environments, deadlines are more flexible than those within universities. Employees are expected to communicate early, ask for help, and work collaboratively towards solutions. And we should also rethink what independence actually means, because in modern society, independence doesn't mean doing everything alone. The most successful professionals seek mentorship, communicate difficulties early, access resources, and know when to ask for help. And that's not weakness, that's competence. The ability to navigate support systems responsibly is itself a life skill. Much of what we call support is actually teaching students how to manage challenges independently in the future. Advocating for themselves, communicating needs professionally, understanding institutional systems, and knowing when to seek help appropriately. At Keele, the Ask service operates on an empowerment model. Students are given information about their rights and responsibilities and supported to resolve issues themselves, rather than having the problem solved for them. And that develops confidence, autonomy, and transferable skills that directly contribute to employability. And that's supported by evidence across the sector. Research shows that 90% of disabled students said support was vital for academic success. 89% said support enabled them to continue their studies. 86% said support improved their mental health and confidence. And that tells us something important, because support is not inflating outcomes artificially. Support is enabling students to remain in education at all. And without it, capable students are often being pushed out of education. And without it, there's a critical difference between challenge and preventable hardship. Challenge develops people, preventable hardship excludes people, and we should be very careful not to romanticize struggle. Financial insecurity, untreated mental health difficulties, disability barriers, inaccessible systems, and academic isolation, they don't automatically create stronger graduates. Very often, they simply force talented students out of higher education. And students today are facing pressures very different from previous generations. Higher tuition fees, rising housing costs, cost of living pressures, a more competitive graduate market, greater financial instability. Many are balancing employment, caring responsibilities, academic pressures, and uncertainty about their futures simultaneously. So this debate cannot be framed about nostalgia for how university used to be. Students aren't avoiding responsibility. They're already demonstrating extraordinary resilience before support even enters the conversation. And sometimes it's important to recognise that institutions themselves generate demand for support. For example, processes such as exceptional circumstances often require students to provide evidence for difficulties they're experiencing, and that pushes students towards overstretched support services simply to meet administrative requirements. In many cases, students are not seeking intensive intervention, they're seeking flexibility within rigid systems. And this debate is not just about the quantity of support, it's about the quality of support. If a student is struggling and given 100 generic resources, but none actually address their issue, then no meaningful support has been provided. Support only matters if it's accessible, timely, and effective. And this becomes especially important when we look at financial support. Keele's own access and participation plan references hardship funds, emergency loans, food voucher schemes, and financial support services. And one fact alone should force reflection. A university does not create food voucher schemes unless food insecurity already exists among its students. And that's not evidence of too much support, that's evidence of students struggling to meet basic living needs while studying. For some students, financial support's not optional, it's the difference between participation and exclusion. You can't claim to widen access while removing the conditions that allow disadvantaged students to remain in education. Ultimately, this debate goes beyond widening participation alone, because support is not something that only certain groups benefit from. Every student benefits from academic feedback, career guidance, pastoral care, peer learning, professional mentorship, and accessible systems. Support is fundamental to education. The real question is whether it's being delivered effectively, equitably, and in ways that genuinely empower students to succeed independently. And I would argue that high standards and strong support are not opposites. In fact, high standards only become meaningful when students are given a fair opportunity to meet them. Otherwise, universities aren't measuring talent or potential, they're measuring who can survive unnecessary barriers. And ultimately, that's why this conversation matters, because it will shape the future direction of this university. And the question now is whether Keele is willing to act on its own evidence. Support is not the opposite of resilience. Good support creates resilience, because independence is not learning to struggle alone. Independence is learning how to navigate challenges effectively, use available resources responsibly, and advocate for yourself when barriers arise. And students succeed not when barriers are ignored, but when they are empowered to overcome them. Thank you.
Fantastic, Sophie. Thank you so much for that. Really grateful. Just a reminder to people about questions. We've got loads of fantastic questions in. It's pretty much last orders on those as Jim speaks, because we'll be deciding on which questions to ask soon after that. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Jim to give the last of the speeches. Jim.
Crikey. I mean, you really don't want to be going last on a panel like this, do you? Look, let me start with your provocation, Kevin. Look, which I'm willing to give you some credit here. I assume it is a provocation rather than a sort of clumsy precursor to a redundancy program, right? Look, the choice obviously isn't between supporting students and preparing them for independence. Sophie is right. Good support is how students learn independence. Clearly, bad support can create dependency, but bad teaching, unclear systems, institutional indifference, they don't create resilience in a reliable or fair way. I mean, I think your example is interesting because I think most of us can think of an example of being thrown in at the deep end and that turning into something that was useful. But being thrown in at the deep end is not a curriculum. The truth, I think, is that an academic who's sort of impossible to contact and grumpy and unable to give useful advice may well create a sort of anecdote that you can use 20 or 30 years later or 40 years later, whatever it is. But the problem is, for some people, it creates a loss of confidence, a weaker mark, a missed deadline, a complaint, a withdrawal, or the conclusion that university isn't for them. And the point for me is that something never did me any harm doesn't mean it didn't do others any harm. Never base policy on survivors, right? The other thing that I think, though, is there's a sort of weird idea of the real world hidden in the argument. And funnily enough, we've carried a blog about this week. And part of it for me is the real world does not only consist of unclear expectations and unfair assessment, right? So, most good workplaces, I think I work at a good workplace, I've got induction and management and reasonable adjustments and supervision and escalation routes and feedback and HR processes and stuff. And, not all employers do all of those things well, but we wouldn't say a bad manager is useful because they prepare you for other bad managers. We just say a bad manager is Not very useful, right? So the question, as I say, for me, isn't whether universities support students too much. It's whether they support students in the right ways, at the right time, for the right reasons. Now, look, one of the problems, I think, is that student support has become this kind of container for a hell of a lot of things. And, you know, it might mean reasonable adjustments or counselling or academic skills or hardship funding or personal tutoring or careers or safeguarding or complaints or conduct or academic problems, mental health, accommodation, cost of living, la, 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 la. And I think part of it is that when everything becomes support, the danger is that universities stop asking what sort of problem they're actually dealing with. It is clear, I think, that some students draw down support because they're in crisis. But actually, lots of students draw down support because the institution's impossible to navigate, they don't get the rules, they can't work out whether a problem belongs with the department or the registry or disability services or wellbeing or whatever. Their assessments are bunched, the timetable clashes with part-time work, the course assumes a full-time student with tons of flexible time where they're sat under trees thinking about things, bumping into people. And some people, on the other side of this, don't draw down support even when they need it. They don't know what exists, they don't know whether their problem is serious enough, they're worried about stigma, they've tried before and they've been passed between services. They are commuting and working and caring or studying on placements and can't attend the moment a service opens. International students worry about immigration, disabled students might be tired of having to disclose, and so on. And part of that for me means that a demand-led model, first come, first served, looks fair whilst reproducing inequality. The students who access support aren't always the ones who have the greatest need. They might be the ones with the most confidence, the best vocab, parents who went to uni. They're not necessarily the ones that have the greatest need. Part of the solution, though, I think, is that we have to talk much more seriously about lateral support, not vertical support. Now, what on earth am I on about? You might remember during COVID, those of you that were around, that there was this sudden and significant increase in demand for support from both professional services staff and academics, massive demand spikes. And I think that most people put that down to students just having a crap, rotten time. But interestingly, our polling at the time told us it was partly because they'd lost access to each other. And I think that what happens is that universities tend to imagine support vertically. Student has a problem, student approaches a service triages, intervenes. And I am not saying that doesn't matter. But students also rely on peers and course communities and student reps and societies and clubs and cultural groups and faith groups and commuting networks and so on and so on. That sort of lateral support is not a nice to have. It's how students navigate university. It's how they find out whether a problem is normal. It's how they decide whether to ask for help. It's how they build confidence and belonging. It's also usually earlier, less stigmatizing and more accessible than turning up at a formal service. Tomorrow morning, just to say, little preview in your Wonkhe Daily, those of you that subscribe, we are publishing a report on this very issue where we differentiate between students who have no friends at all, friends but no friends at university, friends but no friends on their course, and friends either on their course or in their subject area. And guess what? Students who have friends in their subject area demand less support and are more satisfied with getting less support. Lateral support really matters. Do keep an eye out for that. It'll be on the main site whether you subscribe or not. But the final point I want to make, by the way, is just about graduateness. My sense, right, is that students aren't stupid. They know that the things that are formally credited as learning under our credit system are often not enough. They're not round enough. They artificially divide vocational and academic. They downplay the sort of skills students need to thrive in the labour market. And they tend, in more elite universities, to ignore application at the behest of theoretical mastery. How students used to fix that was in their free time. But just as we've over-efficienced university budgets and killed off lots of the slack that helped, we've done the same to students too. And when students don't have, therefore, their time to pick up all this extra stuff, that is about their learning. The question becomes not, do you ask history lecturers to insert skills into their teaching, learning and assessment? It's not issuing additional awards or transcripts for non-academic activity. It's saying that in a maths system, we might need each student to be a bit less formally academic and for our credit system to apply the credit where it's due to learning through volunteering and service and part-time work and so on. That fundamentally is what students need from a belonging point of view, it's what the economy needs, and it's what society needs too. So 5 things: reduce avoidable demand, work out why students are pulling down the services. 2, make formal support easier to use for those people that can't access it. 3, invest in belonging and peer infrastructure. Don't miss that lateral is always just as important as vertical. Be honest about what sits beyond the university too. Universities can't fix all the problems, but they can be really clear about how unfair it is that universities are expected to fix all of the problems. And then finally, if you're a university with a graduate attributes framework, allow students to develop those attributes within the credit system, but outside of the academic subject. And at that point, I'll shut up.
Fantastic. Jim, thank you. Thank you to all of the panel. That was really inspiring. I actually couldn't keep up with the number of fantastic phrases and quotes in there, so I'm going to be going back through the transcript, but we're really grateful for that. We've got loads of questions. What we're going to do is have a 10-minute break. Zoe and I are going to go away and prioritize the questions, and then when we come back, we'll pose them. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you at, I'm going to be very precise, 3 minutes past 7. So great, thank you very much. Right, we are nearly ready to go again. I'm just going to check. Zoe, are you back?
I'm back. I'm in the library.
Oh, well done.
It's resolved. Everything's fine.
Excellent. Paul has just sent us through a list of questions.
Excellent. That's good.
But also feel free to ask your own questions if you've got anything you wanted to ask as well.
Thank you. Should pull that up.
I'll ask the first one, so you've got a bit of time. So welcome back, everybody. Thank you very much for rejoining. We had an exciting break where Zoe and Sophie, who are in the Students' Union, got kicked out of the Students' Union because it was closing and we didn't know. So they have run over to the library. So nice to see both of you. But that did sort of scupper our plans, Zoe, didn't it? So we will do our very best. So what we're going to do is ask a few questions. So the first question I'll ask while Zoe's settling in, and I'm going to ask this one to, let's go with Sir Michael and Paul. And the question is, how can universities strike the right balance between supporting students whilst preparing them for the realities of the workplace and the wider world? Over to you, Sir Michael, on that one.
Well, it's a very, very important question, and I'll just say three brief things. The first is, whenever I hear the word strike the balance, I think, could you say, how could they combine? So instead of balancing, could you combine these things? And because combine is chemistry, as it were, putting things together and getting something different, whereas balancing is classic Newtonian physics, and you have to have one or the other. So I think combining these two things is what universities need to be thinking about. And Jim had a really good idea in his message about giving credit to activities that aren't necessarily pure academic. At Exeter, we give credit to students who mentor disadvantaged students in local and regional secondary schools. They get trained to do it. They get a stipend for doing it, and they get credit for it. And that's just one example. But the things like that I do think are very, very important, because they are preparing people for the world after university. The second thing I want to say is, I thought in her contribution, Sophie made some really strong points about how independence and support go together. So she was making actually my point about combination rather than balance, because if you think the way to get people to be independent is to withdraw support, that is going to be a fatal mistake. Similarly, if you think the only way to do support is to coddle people, to use the title of the book that Paul Greatrix mentioned, you're not going to get there either. So I think that the support is to enable people to become independent, both while they're studying and after they leave university, and that should make people think about what the support is actually like. So those two things are the main points on Jim's and Sophie's points, but they build on my thought about talking about combinations rather than balances.
Right, thank you. Paul?
I mean, I'm a huge fan of the kind of co-curricular program that we've been talking about, where students, it's learning that arises from these activities, which could be work experience, could be volunteering, could be study with an employer, it could be a whole range of things, but it's the learning that arises from these that is assessed and then attracts credit in lots of exciting and flexible ways. And having set them up at a couple of institutions now, I just think they're absolutely fabulous ways of enabling students to get more out of their university experience. So I'm a big fan of those. I do think was one of the things, and I heard it on the Today program this morning, employers bemoaning the skill set of graduates, right? And they've bemoaned the skill set of graduates since the dawn of time, right? Employers always moan about graduate skills. And I think what all that demonstrates is that employers and institutions simply don't see enough of each other and don't understand enough about what happens in the classroom, the skills that graduates have, and how those can be applied in the workplace today. There just needs to be a lot more dialogue. It's hard to do, but it's really important. And then the third thing I'd say is that the careers and employability services within institutions are the most fabulous part of student support mechanisms, right? It's often thought that they're simply telling people that they should just retrain as accountants, whereas actually what they're doing is enabling students to learn about what it is to make the transition from university into the workplace. And they've got a whole range of activities and support and advice that enables that to happen. So I think the careers and employability service is a huge part of this.
Kevin, can I make one more point? I don't want to monopolise, but I think I can't remember which of the panelists, maybe it's more than one of them, mentioned this problem with academic and vocational being seen as opposites or different. Every degree should have some theory and some practice. Leave academic and the rest of it out. Just talk about theory and practice. It's not a degree if it doesn't have some theory in it. Doesn't matter whether it's maths or history or law or whatever. But it also should have some practice. If you're going to be a lawyer, you need some practice, and you can do those things in different orders. If you're going to be a historian, you can do those things in different orders. So the combination of theory and practice, to me, is a very, very important thing in the design of a degree. And that then opens up the kind of things that Paul was just talking about, and Jim was talking about earlier, and Sophie was talking about.
Thank you very much for that. Zoe, have you got a favourite question you want to ask next?
I quite like this question, which was, how can universities or academic staff feel comfortable challenging students in their learning when metrics/evaluations such as the NSS currently have such a large impact on the existence of specific courses in the future? I don't know who would be best to answer that one.
You have to choose a victim. That's part of the co-chairing responsibility.
Great.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've got Jim lined up for the next one.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
Sorry.
Fine. I was going to say Jim for this one, to be honest, but should I say Paul? Paul and Jenny? Would you like to answer that one? You don't want to answer that one? It's fine if you don't. Michael?
Well, I've talked too much already. I'm very. If nobody wants to do it, I'll happily comment on it. But I don't want to.
Michael, let me just say one thing then. I mean, I think that academic staff simply shouldn't worry about what the scores are going to be in a survey about student satisfaction, right? If they do the right thing, they do the best preparation for the lecture they can, and they provide the best engagement and experience for students, then students will be satisfied, right? Chasing ratings, chasing numbers is an absolute mug's game. So challenge, yes. Stimulate, yes. Engage, yes. And if it turns out that you're not very good at it, or actually it just didn't work, then that's too bad. These things come and go, and you'll get another chance next year.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. I think that's perfect.
Just to come back in on that then, though, Paul, if you're on a course that's borderline affordable for the university, and I can tell you this for Keele, if we do poorly in NSS, it really does affect our recruitment. So doesn't that create a problem where you do all the wonderful things that you've just said, you get poor NSS scores, and then the course is decided to not be viable? I'm not saying we would necessarily do that at Keele, but that's a possibility.
But that's where you step back with your academic developers, with your students' union education team, and with the reps on the courses that have existed over the year, and you say, what's going on here, right? Why is everyone really unhappy? And it could be it's just that the bloody heating's off all year round. It could be something as basic as that, right? But you've got to get to the bottom of it, and you've got to understand it before you start shutting courses just on the basis of a few poor NSS results, right? So I think it requires focus and effort from all those involved in the program.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Can I also ask Sophie to maybe speak on that as well? To be awkward.
Sure thing. No, that's fine. Apology if it's a little echo in here. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I think again it goes back to sort of Jenny's point about being like a good human, just kind of recognizing students are people too, lecturers are people too. I know you're worried about sort of satisfaction scores and things like that, but you spend a number of hours a week with these students. Sure, you might not know every one of them's personal whole family history, but you get a kind of feel for who's in your classroom. And so putting that kind of stretch out there is great. Students love to be challenged because, you know, challenge means growth, but perhaps don't just stick something out there that you think, oh, that, you know, this will weed out the weak ones, and just throw an impossible question out there and leave them to kind of struggle in the deep end. It's important, put that challenge out there, but also put out the support structures around it. Offer that kind of one-to-one time if you can. Make sure your email's out there so that students can contact you. Be accessible, and I think it'll go a really long way.
Very good. Should we move on, Zoe? Shall I take the next one? So I was going to ask this one to Jim and Jenny. So is the conversation around the right level of support for students a UK issue, or is this a question raised elsewhere in peer countries? Is there robust data on it? And if the conversation is not peculiar to the UK, how have universities in other countries navigated this? So start with Jim, if that's okay, and then Jenny, if you've got any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, look, doubtless there's a potentially really interesting Asian perspective, North American perspective, and so on. But certainly from a European perspective, and I probably know more about that because we do these study tours with student unions a couple of times a year, there is absolutely no doubt that UK universities spend more money on what I called earlier vertical support, both academic and non-academic support for students, than almost any other country in Europe. But we do need to set that in context. In the UK, our students are almost the youngest students to start a bachelor's degree. We increase it, we've always expected people to go straight from school. And most importantly, by the time they're wearing their graduation cap, they are the youngest students in the OECD. We ram students through our system at top speed, and for a couple of decades, we've demanded that almost none of them drop out. That has costs. I think it has potentially all sorts of costs in terms of their development and their mental health. But from a university perspective, it costs money to produce that sort of miracle that other European countries. I was in Finland a couple of weeks ago, and NUS Finland is having a debate about whether or not the system should speed students up so they complete a bachelor's in less than 7 years. Right? And I'm saying, well, it's 3.1 in England, partly because of the student finance system. We don't allow people to have setbacks and so on. So the point, I think, is that we can have a serious debate about that, but there are trade-offs in terms of expectations about how early people will enter the labour market and how rapidly they will obtain a degree. One other thing I would say about this is every 2 months I read an article that says what students are demanding is to do accelerated degrees. There is absolutely no evidence for this. All the evidence is that what students want is when they hit a setback or need to pause and earn a bit of extra money, that they can obtain the same amount of credit over 4 or 5 years, rather than trying to get it all done in 2 years, straight into a labour market that is pretty unforgiving right now.
Yeah, thank you. Jenny, any thoughts on this international perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Jim said already, and it is very different in different countries, not just because of different higher education processes and systems, but because of culture and expectations and so on. But having said that, when I was doing the work with the mental health task force, we did borrow really good practice from other countries, particularly Canada, that seems to be translatable. But I think it's a very difficult question to answer, really.
Do you want to say a little bit more about what you liked in the Canadian system?
It was one particular college, so I don't know how typical it was across the sector, but it was that piece that I spoke to earlier, where if you're giving a difficult message, say that there is support available, and actually say that it's good to use the support if you need it. And they got some, I can't remember exactly the results, but they did it as a piece of research, and they found better outcomes for that cohort. So it was very powerful.
Very good. And Jim, can I come back on one thing that I thought was really interesting? You talked about this sort of lateral support mechanism, and I was just wondering how do you know that's going to work? I guess as a VC, I'd be worried. It sounds, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, but I wouldn't know that I could track whether we're supporting that student well enough. Are there ways you think we should think about that?
Well, do have a look at your Wonkhe Daily tomorrow morning.
Yeah, okay, another plug.
We have some pretty robust data. One of the things actually both about Canada and Europe is you are significantly more likely to have a group social mentor when you enter the university. You know some people before you arrive, normally organised at subject level. You're significantly more likely to have something that resembles a student union or a student association in your subject. But in the UK, and this is one for, this is one for student union colleagues on the call, for Zoe and Sophie, we're not very good at academic organising. We're very good at clubs and societies and hobbies, not so good at kind of academic associative activity. But crucially, what I can absolutely tell you, and do have a look at the report tomorrow morning, is that where students have different types of friendship generate different types of what people all bundle together in belonging. And broadly, I'm going to give you this example. Any friends help with your mental health. Friends in your subject help you tackle the first essay. Friends in your subject help you work out how much revision you need to do and how much you don't need to do. Friends in your subject actually help you, it turns out, access academic support and regulate it if you're accessing too much of it. Because you talk to your mate and your mate goes, I wouldn't go to the lecturer with that. But your mate goes, I would go to the lecturer with that. So, both the evidence tomorrow morning and all the stuff that I've seen, actually both in Canada and Europe, suggests to me that it's partly a historical accident in terms of how student unions developed. It's partly because we never really, as a country, required regulation of faculties. We've thought about universities rather than faculties. But, the bottom line is we're just not as good at creating community structures that people can get their arms around and where everyone feels they have to help. You can go to a freshers' ball in the UK and you can't imagine you're going to run it next year. That is not the experience in most other countries.
Yeah.
Kevin, Paul's
just put his hand up, then we'll come to you, Michael.
I was going to amplify that a bit because I think there's a really important dimension that works in particularly the UK and North America in certain universities, but not all, which is the residential experience, right? Because I do think that part of what we're talking about here in terms of building community can be and often is delivered through a residential experience, right? Too often, the investment isn't made to enable students within that residential environment to build that community themselves. But when it is, it can really thrive and make a massive difference to students' ongoing sense of belonging within an institution and provide non-subject support of the type that Jim describes as well. So I don't think there's a huge amount to be said where it exists for the residential experience.
And just before we bring Sir Michael in, I guess also then thinking what that means for the commuter students and how they get the similar support and they can bump into people even though they're not staying overnight. Absolutely, yeah. Sir Michael.
I just want to make two points. I have visited universities in the UK where the student union does organise, often in collaboration with the university itself, students around subjects and courses and get feedback, and that becomes a very active process for improving the course. So I pick up Jim's point about student unions and an element of subject focus. The other thing I wanted to say is I work with about a dozen very large American public universities like the University of Louisiana or University of Wisconsin, on reducing dropout rates, which are in some parts of the American system are horrendously bad. And everything in American higher education gets seen through a prism of race. But I won't go into the detail of that. But we had a kind of 3 parts of what you need to look at to get student support right. One was financial support, which obviously does matter, particularly if you're attracting more and more people from low incomes. The second was social support. This point that Jim and others, Sophie have made about friendship groups and so on, and the peer support. So you financial support, social support, and then academic support. And obviously, as Jim was saying, if in your subject you've got students who are thriving and they're your friends and they can direct you through the course. But either whether that happens or not, you need to put in place all 3 bits of that support network. And the result of getting those right, as we saw in those universities, was very, very substantial progress. But we tend to see low-income students as a financial problem, which of course it is, but it's not only a financial problem. And the 3 parts of the triangle are all important.
Great, thank you very much, Zoe. I'm going to pass back to you for the next question.
Yep. So this next question is quite a simple one, but I doubt would be a simple answer. It is, if there needs to be more support for students, who should fund it and what should support focus on? I think I'm going to pass this question on to Michael and Paul, if that's okay. Oh, okay. Jenny, if you would like to step in first, that's absolutely fine as well.
Sorry, I wasn't trying to jump the queue there. I was just so quite a few of the points that I spoke to were actually not about more support, but actually reducing harm to students. So doing things that you're not creating harm or barriers, and particularly I think the inclusivity point is really, really important, because what we often find that we're doing is making up for the experiences that students have had in a non-inclusive or not inclusive enough situation. So I think first do no harm, and then make sure everyone is having a more equitable, navigatable experience, and that's a good start.
Thank you, Jenny.
So,
yeah, Michael, if you want to jump in.
So you asked me to contribute. I'll be very brief on this. There's a lot of areas in public services, and this is one of them, where however much support is provided, the word, I'm stressing the verb, the benefits of the support depend on the active participation of the person who's meant to benefit. So if you want to get somebody to deal with childhood obesity, you have to change diets, increase exercise and so on. And however much government support you pour in, it won't work unless the recipient changes what they do all day. And the same is true here. So you've got the support, the question about funding support. What I'm saying is the same amount of funding will be dramatically more effective if you get the kind of peer group networks that Jim was talking about, and you get the active support of the person who's meant to benefit in that relationship, in whatever the support is. So we need to get out of the mental space of thinking support will solve the problem. We need to get into the mental space of thinking it's the relationship between the support and the student, the beneficiary, that will transform this, and the benefits will be massively enhanced if you get that culture right. The reason I mention that is because obviously everybody's under pressure financially. So the question becomes, could we get much better support for the same amount of money? And I think yes is the answer to that.
Can I jump in there as well and ask, you know, about all the peer support stuff? How can students be more supported in terms of being able to have that peer support together, when with the things that have been mentioned, like cost of living and like other things, because I don't know if students at the moment have that space within themselves to be able to peer support a lot of the time. So I don't know if anyone wants to go into that as well.
there is a risk, and Jim will no doubt contradict me on this, but there is a risk in saying, right, well, you know, we ain't got no money, so over to you, Students' Union, and you just organise some peer support. And if you could just instruct all the students to support each other, that would be just tickety-boo. Thank you very much. I mean, you know, that's a gross exaggeration, but you know, there is often a sense in a university where if you know, people who are heading up and managing the range of support services don't know what to do, they will quite often look to palm it off onto the Students' Union and hope for the best, without the Students' Union necessarily getting any more resources or time or space to actually do anything with it. That's not terribly helpful. In the same way as campaigns for we need another 2 counsellors aren't the solution to, you know, a mental health crisis, right? It actually always goes a lot deeper than that. And I think the real challenge is to find the time and space to have the, you know, the discussions amongst all interested parties, because which it's just very difficult to do, about what works and what doesn't, and where the priorities for investment should be to make the maximum impact in the benefit of the students. And that's really, really hard to do, because it's just much easier to say we're going to cut here and we're going to put a little bit more in there if you're lucky. And that's unfortunately where, you know, it kind of happens. But I do feel for students' unions at times like this.
I just want to debate that, though. So, I agree with what you said, actually, but my advocacy of the partnership around solving the problem is not about making cuts. It's about getting the benefit from the support and the active participation of the student. I'm not saying cut the support and let the students take over. I'm saying get the partnership to work, because that will solve the problem better with the same support, same level of funding. It's a very different thing.
Absolutely. Sorry, I was talking about atypical university response might be, not what.
Yes. No, you're right. No, you're right. It's a risk. Absolutely.
Jim?
Earlier this year, right, I was at a technical university in Germany that's got a staff-student ratio of 50-1, with a, you know, really good teaching quality metrics on student satisfaction. And we were like, how? And, you know, we're not just talking about bits and bobs of study support here. Outside of lectures, those bachelor students were being facilitated by later semester bachelor students who've gone on some of the latest pedagogical training, you know, the most cutting edge stuff. So that's in the culture of teaching and learning. It's students delivering it, and students will turn up to things that other students are running. And, you know, let me put it like this, right? My favourite thing that I've been to for about 3 years now was a couple of years ago, I went to the University of the West of Scotland for their AGM, and the Society of the Year was the Midwifery Society at the Ayr campus. Quite remote. All the students are sort of, you know, middle-aged, largely women. Absolutely no time, massive caring responsibilities. None of them have got previous experience going to university. What they'd sort of randomly decided to do was form an association where everyone had a job, right? So not one of these big volunteer profiles where some hero student gets elected and, you know, does nothing on their course for 6 weeks. Everyone had a role. So, you know, there were 5 of these midwives who took on Facebook, and then 5 of them that took on Instagram, and they were slightly younger because social media bifurcates by age group, right? So about 250 students, 240 of them members of the society, 230 of them had a little job, and that was the Students' Union. But it was more than that. Because it's in Ayr, there's got no careers support, partly because it's nursing. No one from the Students' Union works there. But what they do is there's a variety of central services that back them up and support them. And, you know, for example, earlier on this year, we were at a university in Switzerland where the best careers fairs I've ever seen were run by student associations, not completely on their own, but with backup from the centre rather than the centre putting them on. And this is where I'm just going to say something controversial. About 3-4 years ago, we were working as part of a project with a partner on, you know, career services, what will get students to come to careers events and so on. And lots of career services were adding student staff to their, you complement. And I can tell you now that at least 3/4 of those universities, when the centre has asked them for saving reductions that have been on over the past 2-3 years, it's the student staff that have been the first to go. Now, I am not on this call saying I want to see lots of university staff, academic or non-academic staff, made redundant. But you have to make a conscious choice. You either form communities inside universities to support each other because it's good for mental health, good for belonging, good for outcomes, good for skills, and it's good for delivery, or deep down, you don't really trust students. And every time you put on the front page of a website, and I'm not saying this about Keele, I'm saying generally, every time you put on the front page of a website, our graduates can do amazing things, you have to actually believe that inside the university as well. And too often, honestly, I'll visit a university campus and the poster will say, our graduates are going to change the world, and they don't even let their students change a light bulb.
Very interesting. Zoe, I was going to ask Sophie and Jenny a question, and I was going to come back to you for a killer last question. And I know you've got it in it because you were on my interview panel and I remember it firsthand. So you have a think about what you want to be the very last question. Sophie, I'm really struck by this idea of the importance of the community, and that actually the support and the structure is a community activity and this sort of multi-layer lateral. Just thinking about your experience at our Students' Union, where do you think that falls down at Keele? Where are we expecting you to do things? You're expecting us to do things? Are there gaps that you're seeing?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it's learning about the ever-changing, ever-developing student population. Because historically, especially at Keele, all students lived on campus, all staff lived on campus. It was easy. All they had to do, walk out their front door, and you're with Keele students, you're in a Keele environment, you can walk down the road to the Students' Union and you'll find a group of people, right? But now on, you've got people in other countries who haven't even flown to the UK. You've got people who are from all over the country who maybe travel in once a week if they're on one of our apprenticeship courses, things like that. So I think it's being able to have that really diverse kind of ways of engagement and ways to, because obviously we've heard some of our other panel members are even, at university themselves. You guys have got lives, jobs, families, and you're here to learn also. And you'll want community in different ways than an 18-year-old who's just come out of school. So I think it's a rapid development as well. It's something that literally year by year is changing and is growing. And I think we've got to learn to adapt, because I think the students that are on campus, those 18-year-olds that have come out of school and they don't know anything and they're entering the big wide world and they're living on campus, they are going to need that support. This is the first time that they've lived away from home, from family, and they're going to need that kind of peer-to-peer connection in person. It's what they're used to. It's how we'll make them feel comfortable. But that's not everything. It's crucial to those students, but there's more than one type of student nowadays, and that's where I think we need to be learning.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for that. And Jenny, I've been telling everyone to read the HEPI report that you were a co-author, The Future of Campus University, because I thought it was a great, so it very much links with this in terms of future support and some of Jim's points about bringing it actually into the core of the course. That report spoke about the role of technology, and I'm just wondering, have you seen any signs that technology could be a way in which we could not increase costs but improve the support structures?
That is a really difficult question to answer, because it will make some things cheaper. It might be teaching, it might be assessment, it might be the things that you don't want to replace. And what else? Sorry, can you say the question again?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the role of technology in support, and whether in doing the report that you did, you have any confidence in that. I mean, I think we all have the chatbot experience that that all it's doing is delaying you getting to a human being. But at the same time, our students do like the instant accessibility of that as well.
Well, let me say this. That particular report very much said the campus experience becomes more important, because kind of that's your USP, because there's going to be a lot of increasingly AI involved in the teaching and the assessment and so on, because that's the easiest bit to replace. But actually, I think the flip side of this, and I have started talking and writing about this, is there's another model, which is that it's all online and it's done by AI and it's very cheap. Well, maybe not. The money will be going to someone, to some people, some tech bros. But yeah, it could actually, we could have a sort of a split. I mean, we can see bits of it already in the sector, but if you have money, you go on campus and have a lovely time and learn lots of skills and all sorts of great stuff. If you don't have much money, you might just sit there online and be taught by an AI. So it's a bit dystopian, really.
It links very much with Sophie's point about, you know, different types of students and making sure that the support and the experience is good for all of them and not just, you know, driven by cost and experience and ease. So, Zoe, did you want to close with any particular question for the panel?
Not that I've made personally.
You can ask anything. Go to the crowd.
That's fine then. It's quite a long one. So I'll just read it out. The panel has made a compelling case that student support services are essential to both student wellbeing and institutional success. Yet when budgets are squeezed, these services are often among the first to face cuts. Throughout my career, I've had to argue for what should be basic principles, that counselling cannot be delivered effectively in open plan spaces, that many students cannot access therapeutic support through GPs in a timely manner, and that universities have a responsibility to support students harmed on campus rather than simply referring them elsewhere, which I think are very good points. So my question is, how can we continue to make the case for prioritising student support services in this time of budget restrictions?
Maybe we'll ask that and also ask for final thoughts from everyone as well as part of the answer.
I think that's a good idea as well. Okay, Jenny, you want to start?
Yeah, just to address that question, I think it's almost unanswerable, because one of the strategies is to have closer relationships with the NHS, have protocols, what can be dealt with by the university, what can be dealt with seamlessly through the NHS. Problem is the NHS is very underfunded as well, so it's kind of becomes a bit of a zero-sum game. So it's a very difficult one to answer, I think.
Thank you, Jim.
Let me do a little brief read across for the hidden profession on university campuses, which is the professional staff that work in student union advice centres. There's thousands of them. They're always complaining about caseload. The demands on them are increasing. But I'll tell you what I often say, which doesn't win me many friends. The bulk of people who turn up at a student union advice centre with an academic appeal have been let down earlier on their core. And if those student unions spent a bit more time pointing out to students that however impenetrable it looks, B2 in the OFS regulatory framework gives students the right to feedback in a timely manner, give students the right to staff that actually teach them and support them and so on, they wouldn't be failing, they wouldn't be coming in their droves with an academic appeal that is ultimately going to fail anyway, and everyone would be happier. And I think there is a read across right across professional services, which is, I know it's tough. You know, it's a bit like the debate in accident and emergency in the NHS. It always looks like that's the bit you need to spend money on when it's really health promotion that you should spend money on. But, you know, for example, what I often say to universities is, you know, all those failed academic appeals that you've got where a student has said, where you've ended up saying, sorry, academic judgment. reading all the reasons why students have submitted them, which is often poor supervision, poor support, something went wrong, the timetable doesn't work, and so on, and learning from them can cause there to be less demand on the acute services that, you're right, whoever the questioner was, we must continue to spend money on.
Completely agreed with that, to be honest, Jim. Thank you. Paul, have you got anything to add to what Jim said, or is it a separate point entirely?
No, I was just going to build a little bit on what Jim said, because I do think, and this goes back to your earlier point as well, Jim, is that actually student success is everyone's responsibility, right? It's not just something that, you know, it's pointing someone to the right department to solve their particular problem. And this goes back to the point that Michael was making. I mean, you've got to view student success in a university environment holistically. You can't just do it as something that can be put into individual boxes. And when there's a time of financial constraint, that's particularly important, that people pull together rather than actually get into opposition just to scrabble over a small pot of resources. I think the really hard thing to do, as with any kind of strategy development, is to step back and look honestly at the data and the information and the feedback you get from students in particular, and say, what is it telling us really about what life is like at our university, and how can we make it better, and what can we do for the short term and all the long term as well to make things better and enable students to get the most of what we're providing. It's really difficult to do, but it's fundamental to strategic success in a time of resource constraint. Universities have been here before. It's just that it feels tougher now than it perhaps ever has done.
Thank you, Paul. I guess it also emphasises the importance of collaboration between university and SU as well. Having student voices being heard all the time. I know, you know, this is rehashed all the time, but I feel like it's still an important point to make, that, you know, you can't really learn student struggles without students in the room. So yeah, I think I just wanted to end on that point a little bit. Do we want to do final thoughts?
Well, let's hear from Michael and Zoe just on any subject, really, in terms of your thoughts on this evening. Well,
very good debate, and I'm glad to have been able to listen to it. I would make one sort of big point about the funding context. I think we haven't mentioned it tonight, but the British universities are among the best in the world. If you go I've worked in 50 or 60 countries. I get told that again and again, and we've got fantastic universities, and all the problems that we've just been discussing are real, but the context is we've got a fantastic university system that we need to develop and take forward, and at some point that will need extra funding. I would say two things about that. One is, it would be really good if you could get a cross-party review of funding. I went to see both leaders of education secretaries of both opposition and government before the most recent election, and tried to get them to do something joint, but obviously I failed. I think that needs to happen. It needs to be strategic and at least look a long way ahead, because the universities are such a fundamental part of Britain's future, not just for the students in them, but for the research and all the rest. And the funding review needs to look at everything to do with funding, including research, as well as the student experience and all the rest of it. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is, for my advice to anybody in the university is, if you want to persuade governments of the future to review and or invest in universities, you need to tell them how good you are and the good things you're doing. You don't need to, nobody's done this on this call, but what you don't want to do is get into the mindset of, we've got to whinge about how awful is everything, and then they'll invest in us. That's the wrong way around. Tell them what a fantastic job you're doing, and then they'll see it's worth investing in.
Thank you very much. Shall we hear, Sophie, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, sure. I just want to thank every panelist for coming today as well. I know I'm not chairing, but thank you for coming as part of the university, obviously as a student union rep. I really appreciate everyone, because I know you've all got very long and busy histories and lives and things that you've got going on. So I really appreciate your contributions to today. And I just think it's great hearing that people from sort of outside university itself, people from government, from housing, from everywhere, who have a very wide view of what's going on at the moment, especially politically and everything like that, care so deeply about the issues that students are facing. And so I'm really thankful and grateful for you guys. And I just think the key theme today for me has been sort of partnership between staff and students, partnership between university and students' union, but partnerships also between obviously university and government. I think, you know, there are certain things that would really benefit students, you know, the NHS working more closely with student services, because sometimes it can get into a thing where a student goes, I'm kind of struggling to student services, and student services, oh, go, great, we'll refer you to the NHS. And the NHS goes, as the NHS does, and the student goes, okay, great, but I'm still struggling with my university coursework, what do I do? And so, you know, just strengthening those processes would be incredible. And things like only being able to register at one GP. Students have an on-campus life, they also have an off-campus life, even if they do live on campus. Being at home 3 months, 4 months of the year and not being registered at your home GP, it's things like that could really sort of go a long way in a student's life. And, you know, I look forward to doing those things and working on these things in my hopefully long future career. But I appreciate everyone's support and stuff so far. Yeah.
Super. Sophie, thank you very, very much. I think we'll bring this to a close because we're eating into people's evening, but can I just do a massive thank you to co-chair Zoe and everyone on the panel for an outstanding contribution. The one disadvantage of being online, if we were in the lecture theatre, you would now get a rapturous round of applause, and people may be able to do it virtually, but can I just, on behalf of everyone virtually, give you that rapturous round of applause. Thank you so much for everything. This all feeds into the new Keele strategy, which we're very, very excited about. Just a reminder to staff who are online, you've still got about a month to submit your ideas. Everyone across the university is being invited to submit ideas for the strategy. We're also going around and engaging with all the students, so thanks very much to the Students' Union for your support on that. We've had lots more really good questions. I'm going to personally go through the questions. There's some very Keele specific ones which we will come back and answer directly, but thank you so much. Questions were great and we really appreciate everyone's contribution, so thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to stay online, Zoe, for a sec? Thanks, Mark.